You are listening to the Necropolis podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelley from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion magazine.
Welcome to Necropolis. I am Shelley from HateMeditations.com, and we got your letters, America. Based on a couple of comments we've had on our videos recently, we've decided to do an At the Gates focus episode, and that is precisely the reason why you're hearing my voice instead of the soothing, dulcet tones of Jason, because he doesn't have very nice things to say about At the Gates, to be honest, so he's decided to step out this episode. But fear not, as ever, we have the reliable Tyler, who is joining, the reassuring voice and opinions of Tyler. Good to have you back, as always.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm really excited about talking about At the Gates today.
Thank you very much. And we also have Raphael back. I'm very pleased to announce that he's returning for this episode, so great to have you on, Raphael.
Hello, thanks for having me again, Jason.
And we should also be having Roman join at some point from Into Oblivion, because he is a huge At the Gates fan. So we did want to have him on to discuss things, but he appears to be running a little late, so we'll just get going, and then if he does join in a bit, that's great. So yeah, we're talking about one of the great sort of enigmas of death metal, I suppose, in At the Gates. They're sort of one of the shortest they've got one of the most confusing discographies, I think, out of all of the sort of classic death metal bands, and one of the most inconsistent, I would say, not just in terms of quality, but also stylistically as well. But they've also been sort of canonized by various different sort of factions within the death metal fan base, because they popularized the sort of melodic death metal sound, which became the popular face of like extreme metal by the late 90s, along with like Dark Tranquillity and In Flames and the likes of Arch Enemy a little bit later. But then, their early material is regarded as really quite sophisticated and idiosyncratic when compared to especially their Swedish like counterparts, but also just more broadly as well. They're incredibly kind of odd albums with a lot of kind of different material to discuss. But I guess we should start at the very beginning, and I wanted to just quickly discuss Grotesque. Which are one of these kind of, what's the word I was thinking of earlier? The creche of Swedish death metal, along with the likes of Nihilist as well, the sort of pre-entombed, Unleashed outfit. And Grotesque, it had a couple of members from At the Gates who kind of came and went intermittently. So obviously the one and only Al Svensson was did a brief stint with them on one of their EPs, the Incantation EP. And we also had obviously the vocalist Thomas Lindberg, who was in Grotesque the entire time, and you kind of get a very, very early formation of not just what At the Gates would become, especially obviously on the tracks that Al Svensson was on, but also like the early formation of Swedish death metal as it was trying to strive for a more complex way to articulate melody within what is still quite an atonal form of music. There's a lot of like Slayer in there. There's even some sort of proto-black metal in the form of Sarcophago and maybe even Blasphemy, a bit more formalized, but there's also the beginnings of the kind of melodic turn. And what I love about Grotesque, particularly the material that Al Svensson contributed to, is it is trying to be quite long form and really, really ambitious in terms of song structure, which is not something you get so much in pre-1990 death metal, especially in Europe. Obviously, like Morbid Angel and the likes were experimenting with that by this time. But in terms of especially sort of Scandinavian death metal, it was still very much steeped in thrash and punk as well. And obviously, trying to articulate melodic forms, but I don't think anyone achieved it to date to quite that extent that Grotesque did at the time. And yeah, I think they're really important sort of band to look into if you're interested in the early At the Gates kind of style and how it slowly sort of came into being around that time. So yeah, the compilation that was released much later kind of brings together their early EPs. In the Embrace of Evil compilation, it brings together a few of the EPs. There's only a few demos missing from this. I think it's all of their studio material that was collected together, plus a couple of later tracks that I think were written in about '96 for the compilation itself. But I kind of don't ignore them as sort of not canon. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on Grotesque to just kick us off.
Grotesque is pretty interesting and exciting for what they are. In some ways, in comparison to other bands of that style, I would say, and I mean this in a very conditioned way, that the album is unimportant in the sense that it's not, while it's very important when talking about the subject of At the Gate specifically, it's not, I think, as historically influential as other music of that style. If you could, because clearly it's going for that style of collision between speed metal and early death metal that you heard in bands like Possessed and Slayer and perhaps early Sepultura. Um, and all of those bands I listed, I think, were far more formative to the early death metal than Grotesque was. But that doesn't mean that it's bad music. It's still a really kind of delightfully um, evil and powerful expression. Um, and it's also really interesting to listen to it in the context of how it develops over the course of the compilation, because you really hear, when listening, although it's not necessarily all in chronological order on the compilation, you really get to hear an interesting development from kind of the typical uh, speed metal slash early death metal approach of having a predominant rhythmic figure in the course of the song that is commented upon or has slight variations of throughout the course of the song, too, as you were mentioning, Shelley, more of an attempt to create a long form composition where a melody sort of emerges from the chaos, so to speak. So yeah, it is a really interesting compilation. Something that I do enjoy listening to from time to time.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that in that it is attempting long form, but I kind of, yeah, we'll just clarify. I don't think it succeeds necessarily. It's something that I kind of forgive because it was an early attempt, as it were. And it is still kind of early in the days of extreme metal exploring this kind of territory. But I do find some of the tracks a little bit disjointed, like they're still overcoming their influences in, yeah, the bands that you mentioned, obviously Slayer and Possessed and Sepultura, really kind of obviously present in the Grotesque material, and they haven't quite found a way to add their own, the beginnings of their own kind of style and craft to that and integrate it smoothly. I think at this point it is still a little bit clunky. And to your point about it being more interesting in the context of At the Gates, I think as far as like the members are concerned, obviously the other arm of like Grotesque was Necrolord, who I'm less familiar with, and by all accounts is a less interesting figure on the musical side than Al Svensson and Thomas Lindberg. But also just on Lindberg as well, you do get a very early example of his vocals, and he is a really distinctive vocalist within death metal. There weren't many vocalists that were reaching for the higher end of the range. At this point, he's not quite expressed that yet. He's still sounding quite typical of the time, the sort of slightly more distorted version of like the thrash metal bark. But it is quite interesting to sort of see how that develops in those early years. So yeah, Raphael, do you have anything to add on Grotesque?
Well, I don't think I have much to say besides what you guys have already said. Well, I do think that Grotesque is pretty interesting for what it is, but it's what happens in all of these cases, which is it becomes very difficult to judge it on its own instead of as a preparation for At the Gates. And I think that's exactly what it is in the end. It's good on its own, as I said, but it feels more like a prelude to greater things to come. It feels like very much like something transitional, as you were saying. They try to do these, work out these interesting ideas like longer form melodies, etc., and trying to mix that with their more earlier influences like Slayer and thrash. But it still feels like very much like an experiment, like something that is not very. It doesn't have, let's say, the confidence of their later work. So yeah, that's pretty much. I think that's sums up what I think about them.
Yeah, and to that point as well, it's remarkable that barely a year later, they'd formed as At the Gates, and they pretty much have all of the members that they still have today, barring Al Svensson. And they managed to produce the Gardens of Grief EP, their debut EP. Which is barely even 20 minutes, but it's remarkable how much definition and identity and maturity it has compared to the Grotesque material. Again, there is this tendency to look at it as Raphael says, as preparatory to The Red in the Sky Is Ours, and obviously you've got City of Screaming Statues on here as well. Chiefly in the fact that at this point At the Gates we're writing melody in such a way that it felt like it was written for stringed instruments like violins and so on. Although on here you get much more, you get use of keyboards rather than the violins you'd see on the album to follow. But also the riffs themselves feel like they might have been written for violin and then transposed to guitar. But this differs from the full length in that, and Tyler and I were discussing this just before we started recording, that it is a more typical death metal sound from At the Gates, but also that is kind of one of its greatest strengths in that it manages to embody the kind of the malevolence and mysticism and world building of all of the great death metal from around this time, whilst also allowing space for that very, very unique Al Svensson approach to melody, which is just kind of to introduce a theme that might be quite simple and a little bit rudimentary or even clunky at first appearance, and then he kind of just hammers it home and unpacks it and approaches it from every conceivable angle over the course of a track until it's kind of evolved into something completely new. And he'll sort of do that with the introduction of other themes as well, or leveraging more typical kind of death metal techniques in there, because they were also sort of masters of rhythmic interplay as well. But yeah, it's not the kind of melodic death metal that you would now associate with the term in a sort of post Slaughter of the Soul sense. It's much more kind of tangential melodies and almost little experiments and little vignettes that happen throughout the track that kind of serve to sort of unpack these main themes as the track progresses. And all of this is like incredibly sophisticated for what is essentially a debut EP. And I kind of kick myself that I haven't listened to it more. I always go for the full length albums. It's one of my kind of shortcomings as a listener. I tend to overlook EPs unless they're sort of absolutely essential. But I guess I should add this one to the roster as well, because it's incredibly instructive for not just At the Gates, but like the formation of the early, not even Swedish, but like Northern European approach to death metal that kind of was a counterpart to what was going on in Florida at the time.
Yeah, you really need to get on board the EP train, because some groups, their EPs are some of their finest work. Morpheus Descends and Hypocrisy are two in particular I can think of where I think that their best music is on their EPs, not on their full lengths, as much as I enjoy some of their full lengths. But this would be almost another case I could just about say with as much confidence, because personally, in some ways, I enjoy listening to Gardens of Grief more so than The Red in the Sky Is Ours, and I'll get more into that when we're discussing the full length. But Gardens of Grief is very interesting because, as Shelley and I were discussing prior to starting recording, it has what Shelley, I think, and I was somewhat alluding to with saying it's more of a typical death metal release is the way I put it is it has that death metal mythos to the music in that there is a kind of conscious attempt to create a feeling of darkness, to create a sensation of confrontation with forces that make you aware of your mortality. And to put that in less poetic and really simple language, the music is more obviously dark than what you have on The Red in the Sky Is Ours. It's more unsettling is the word that I used. In some ways, it's unsettling in a manner that's reminiscent of what you would hear later on in Dark Throne and Burzum, with its sort of off-kilter approach to melodies, and really interestingly, in its attempt to have some rhythm and melody almost kind of imitate some unsettling sort of natural phenomenon, almost like like if you're wandering alone in the woods at night and you hear the breaking of tree branches behind you or something, like someone's following you. There's like a sense of like creating noise, so to speak, that is emulating an experience that would put you into fight or flight mode. And that's reflected, I think, even in some of the subject matter of the album as well, in ways that are less personal, perhaps, than The Red in the Sky Is Ours. You really have a very dark and melancholic, in a kind of more, how do I want to put this, in a kind of more destructive way, approach to its thematic angle on this EP. And in other ways, musically, it's very similar to, more similar, so anyway, to other death metal of the time. There's comparisons to be drawn to Incantation, for instance, I believe, and it's got more of those heavy, low-end, first 5-fret power chord anchors that then have a kind of tremolo melody that rises above the chaos that kind of ascends out of them. But all in all, I'm a really huge fan of the Gardens of Grief EP. I think that if Roman were here, he would really love to hear me say that, because I used to be of a very different position and preferred the debut full length, and he was always trying to defend the merits of the EP to me, which I enjoyed, but insisted that the full length was better, and I've kind of switched over more to his side over the years.
Yeah, I'm on the fence because in some sense it's not a fair comparison, because Gardens of Grief is quite short. Well, it's average for an EP, but it's a shorter, obviously, like it's less material on there to kind of go at, but also it's not a strikingly different style, but there is enough of a difference in it to kind of think, oh, what if they'd sort of written a full-length version of this that wasn't The Red in the Sky Is Ours, because that is an odd album for reasons that we'll get into. But what if they'd sort of stayed more of a typical death metal band, but still with those really unique kind of calling cards? And just talking about comparisons again, one of the things that really jumped out at me, especially on the track itself, At the Gates, was Demolic. You can kind of hear the early kind of rumblings of the sort of weird, bizarre kind of chromatic 3D riffcraft that Demolic would indulge in on the track At the Gates. It kind of goes from more typical kind of riffing to very, very strange chromatic patterns that kind of eventually resolve themselves. And also, to your point on it being quite sort of atmospheric in its own way and sort of going much more for a creepy sort of glum expression as opposed to out and out aggression. I think that At the Gates is the track as well where the introduction is just that stilted drum beat that comes out of a very, very eerie synth line. And again, it does just sort of evoke like that sense of stumbling and walking, and then suddenly, the riffs come in and it kind of takes the song in a completely different direction. And I also do want to unpack the lyrics as well, because that is one of the other reasons why At the Gates are quite an interesting kind of prospect, because they were neither one thing nor the other in terms of lyrics. They were very gothic in a way and very personal and emotional, and that is something that we often criticize in later death metal. But this iteration of At the Gates kind of pointed to a way to do it right, for want of a better word, to do it in a way that is still universal and profound, and I don't want to use the word transcendental because I think it's kind of overused, but it's almost poetic in a way, where it's tapping into something, but it's not leaning into self-indulgences or individualist kind of, self-therapizing and so on. There's a little bit more to it than that, which kind of harkens to the sort of romantic poetry or gothic horror, where you're really trying to get to the like kernel behind your fears or behind your paranoia and so on.
I wholeheartedly agree. I would say that Thomas Lindbergh, at his best moments, was one of the finest lyricists in all of extreme metal. And before I hand it back off, as an interesting historical aside, At the Gates was dedicated to the late vocalist of Mayhem, Dead.
Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, no, just to that point as well, it's kind of aided by the fact that his vocals are quite maniacal, and as I already mentioned, they're quite high pitched, and he does have a very distinctive style. But yeah, not just the fact that the lyrics are great, but he also knows how to deliver them to achieve like maximum effect. But yeah, sorry, I don't want to go too far off track. So yeah, Raphael, what are your thoughts on Gardens of Grief?
Well, right off the bat, I would say that I know this might sound a bit superficial, but I'll probably tend more towards the first full length album, simply because, well, there are more songs, so you get a fuller taste of that style. But yeah, but of course, I really like the EP, the Gardens of Grief, and I think it works again. It works very nicely as a sort of a prelude or a first taste of the album. Yeah, and At the Gates at that point already had. I think it's fair to say that they already had their own style fully formed, more or less. And yeah, also as an aside, I totally agree with what Tyler said about the lyrics. I think that At the Gates definitely has probably, well, I'm not sure if the best, but very surely some among the best lyrics that in all of death metal. Totally.
Well, yeah, they completely kind of went their own way with the lyrics, and that's not to say that like the other classic death metal bands were all kind of just following the same pattern, although some of them were clearly, but that is kind of one of the hallmarks of some of these greater artists is they're not just um, they're not just bands in a way. They kind of create. This is going to sound absurdly pretentious, but just bear with me. They kind of create their own little world. They engage in world building, and they invite the listener to kind of spend some time in that world and explore it and understand the ideas behind it. And that is true of like a Morbid Angel or an Incantation and so on. But it's also true of At the Gates in that it's not just the intellectual side of it that you're being asked to appreciate. There's sort of a whole kind of other universe that they ask you to kind of join and partake in that you can explore, and that's one of the reasons why these works last the test of time, is because there are so many elements to unpick that you can kind of appreciate.
We have to get Roman's opinion on Garden.
I was just about to say, Roman, you've just joined at the right time, because we're just wrapping up the discussion on Gardens of Grief, so you joined just in time.
Oh, perfect. Okay, that's like literally one of my top 10 of all time. Yeah, that's I think that's their best work, personally. I think I would rate it higher than The Red in the Sky Is Ours, which, I mean, fantastic release, obviously. I don't know, there's something about Maybe it's cliche to say and oft repeated, but there's just something so Wagnerian feeling about the riffs on Gardens of Grief, and I love there's the strong themes that come through, and the alternation between when they got the counterpoints and the weird dissonant harmonies and stuff like that, but then you get those moments where the riffs come together in unison. It's like so cavernous and abyssal. I'm thinking City of Screaming Statues obviously is probably the standout for that, but I also really like their eponymous, I suppose you would say, song At the Gates. That one's awesome. I mean, heck, I couldn't say enough good things about Gardens of Grief. I think what has the discussion been like so far, though? Just getting on here.
Well, we were obviously drawing comparisons with the debut, and I was kind of saying I'm sort of kicking myself because I'm less familiar with Gardens of Grief. Obviously, I've listened to it, and I've listened to it for some years, but just not nearly as much as the debut. But I was listening to it today in preparation for this, and it really did strike me how they managed to capture the uniqueness of At the Gates' approach to melody at this time, but also knit it into, I guess, what Tyler has been calling the mythos of death metal at this time, which is something that maybe The Red in the Sky Is Ours lacked, because it's a much sort of purer, kind of more direct way to unpack melody, whereas Gardens of Grief still has that malevolence and moments of atonality. They're a little bit closer in style to contemporaries at this time, but in a good way. And I was also, just unpacking the titular At the Gates track as well, and sort of saying in some ways it anticipates a band like Demolik, but you could also draw comparisons with Incantation as well. We were also just saying how fantastic the lyrics are and how they add an element of kind of paranoia and almost gothic kind of horror to it, but in a really kind of sophisticated and subtle way compared to other artists that have tried to sort of work in those aesthetic territories.
Definitely. I also want to say, when you go through these songs, Souls of the Evil Departed is a little bit different because it kind of almost has well, there's kind of a pseudo chorus where it kind of goes into that D beat part, and it's like Souls of the Evil Departed, and then there's a riff underneath, and you can kind of identify the that riff as being, I don't know, kind of like a strong thematic riff of the song. But in the song At the Gates and in the song City of Screaming Statues, it's actually very interesting how, though these songs are not conventional verse chorus kind of songs, it's by any stretch of the imagination, there's no obvious way of figuring out the structure, but there's no manual, there's no guide to it, but there are just these very strong riffs that stand out, and you're like, that's the main motif of the song, that's the central motif, and everything is built around that one. I would need to get some timestamps here, but if we're thinking in the song At the Gates itself, it's that one that comes right before. Hang on. Oh yeah, it's the one that comes right before the Lord of Chaos Let Me Sleep thing. The do 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 bono do no. I mean, it's that one right there, and then in City of Screaming Statues, there's man, I'd have to think about that one right there. But anyways, it is fascinating how, to me personally, how perfect of a death metal release this is. It has all that. It has that paranoia. It has that, that obscurity and that just cavernous abyssal sound to it. And it's so it's much more, I guess, alien, for lack of a better word, when you compare it to a more emotionally accessible release like The Red in the Sky Is Ours, or a more conventional one with Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness. For lack of a better word, it's you can kind of feel the nihilism on this one a little more strongly, I guess I would say.
And it's also, we had a quick chat about Grotesque as well. We were saying how remarkable it is, how fully formed At the Gates were at this point, because this is their debut EP. And it's I love Human Waste, I love the early Morbid Angel EPs, and Abominations, obviously. And you do get like a little kind of snippet of where those artists were at this time. But Gardens of Grief, it sounds like an incredibly mature um, piece of music, and I almost wish it was developed more into like a full length. Although obviously there's, the Red in the Sky is Ours does follow on from it in very obvious ways, but it also, as you say, it lacks that kind of underlying the sort of muscularity to it as well.
Yes.
When you compare it to debut EPs from their contemporaries, it's light years ahead.
Yeah, and I think we can chalk that up to the fact that, well, I mean, these guys had all been in other bands before that. I mean, the obvious one to point out is Grotesque, obviously. Alf Svensson being the main brains behind At the Gates. You can tell because once he left, they started doing Terminal Spirit Disease and Slaughter of the Soul. He was already doing Grotesque before that, and yeah, Grotesque is great band, but it's much more conventional by comparison. I think they hadn't done any actual material, but they were both in Liars in Wait. Both the guitarists were in Liars in Wait before this EP. But obviously Liars in Wait didn't do anything until 91, 92, so I think we can't chalk that up to their musical development. Who knows what they were actually playing at that time. So I think the previous experience in Grotesque, at the very least, is something you can chalk that up to. Like, they'd kind of waded through the demo phase with the previous band.
Yeah, we did. As we were discussing Grotesque, we said, the influences in that are far more obvious, particularly around kind of early death metal and early speed metal in Slayer and Sepultura and things like that. And you get moments where they are trying to articulate that very, very idiosyncratic approach to melody that Svensson would become known for. But yeah, you're probably right. He kind of got that part out of his system, and then by the time they were ready to release Gardens of Grief, it was all in place. So we can call back to this, but I think it's time for us to start unpacking The Red in the Sky is Ours. Which is, full disclosure, I am partisan in this. It is one of my all-time favorite albums. And I did discuss it with Jason when we did a tier list on death metal from 1992. Jason made no bones about the fact that he does not get it. He wasn't impolite, but he said, as a big fan of classical music, he doesn't really get anything from a death metal album that is basically pure melody. And I'm using this word melody sort of caveated, as I've already mentioned. It's not what would later be known as melodeath or whatever. It's much more sophisticated than that. And also it kind of, although at the Gates they were using atonality, dissonance, things like that, and chromaticism, they were also playing in very, very traditional melodic forms, which death metal wasn't really doing at the time. And this was also, it wasn't sort of, as we've already said, obviously it wasn't sort of verse, chorus, pop structures and stuff, but it was, I hesitate again to use the word progressive, but I think it is warranted in this way. I could compare it to something like Unquestionable Presence in how flowing and smooth it is, but how complex and choppy it can be at times and disruptive. And I wouldn't say jazzy, but there is that undercurrent to it, but it's worked in so subtly that it kind of gets under the skin. They're not beating anyone over the head with trying to be kind of intellectual, brainy with it, although I think Jason would probably disagree with me there. But you also get the continuation of Gardens of Grief in some ways, in that they were using violin on this, and it does crop up throughout the album, and a lot of the riffs feel like they could have been written for violin and were transposed onto the guitar. And again, lyrically, it plays with similar themes. It goes deep into kind of the paranoia, the kind of that sense of maniacal gothic horror, and again, the vocals kind of really lend it that sense of almost like desperate panic, but not in a way that it was done later in kind of, you know, metalcore and stuff. When I'm using these words, I mean something very, very different to what something like metalcore would become a decade or so later. It's much more, again, aligned with that poetry, the romantic poetry, or the gothic horrors that were much more like a rumination on the human condition, and these fears and these paranoias were kind of a way to sort of unpack that in different ways. And when it's set to these quite complex songs, and when you get Lindbergh's just utterly like unique vocal style within death metal, it really does kind of lend it that sense of gravitas. So I'm going to go around, but I'll do it in a slightly different order this time. But jump in whenever you feel like. So, Raphael, do you have any opening remarks on Red in the Sky is Ours?
Oh well, I'm not sure. I don't remember if I ever said this like in a previous podcast, but I think I have definitely said this like in conversation with you. Yeah, The Red in the Sky is Ours is absolutely one of my favorite death metal albums, or even metal albums. In fact, and I think I already said this to you. I think it might, if I had to choose one, it might be my favorite. I'm not sure if that's a very heretical opinion or what, but it definitely is. It definitely is something very sincere on my part. I think that it definitely has. You emphasized a lot the gothic horror aspect, which I think it's definitely a dimension there. But I would also like to emphasize that besides that, it also is a very beautiful album. I think, and very elegant. It feels very elegantly constructed. The way I think this is one of those cases where the expression, maybe a bit overused, of a riff labyrinth actually proves true. You feel like you can get lost in the songs, the way they have these all these different excursions and movements, and sometimes in a almost nervous, maniacal way. The way the songs, I'm thinking of Neverwhere, for example, which is an almost, well, not quite jazzy, but a very hyperactive song. The way it goes through all these different motions, and of course the anguished vocals that further emphasize this sense of like restlessness and paranoia and despair. But at the same time, it feels. I think at the same time it feels very, as I was saying, very elegant, very beautiful, very light in a sense. I think it's a completely unique sense of melody, completely unique sense of song construction and world building, as you were saying in regards to the first EP. But I think even more so in this album because, well, not least because there are more songs, so more to sink your teeth into. And yeah, I think the one of the things that first caught me when I first started listening to this album was the fact that it really worked as a complete unit. Like the lyrics really added to the experience, and I think it was a very, I think you really hit it nail on the head when you talked about the world building, because indeed you do feel, as I was saying earlier, you feel like you can get lost in the songs, and the lyrics are a big part of that as well. I think they are fascinating images, very poetic for this type of music. So yeah, I mean, I could go on, forever, but this is, as I was saying, this is I think it's one of the greatest achievements in death metal in terms of composition and just overall quality, definitely.
Yeah, I should also add one thing I forgot to mention was the two releases either side of this, the Guardians of Grief EP and then With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness. That's one of the most annoying things about the gates. Just, you don't need so many words in your album titles. Anyway, I think The Red in the Sky is Ours was self-produced, whereas the other two were recorded at Studio Sunlight, and the subsequent albums as well, which is kind of what aligns them more with typical Swedish death metal in particular, whereas The Red in the Sky is Ours, it is a very beloved album by like fans of Later at the Gates and their detractors alike, but it is a very direct. It's not rough. It's still like a good quality recording, especially for something of this time. But it lacks any kind of flair or anything like that. So you are just getting a direct, constant stream of compositions through you. Whereas a lot of other albums at the time, they had more levers to pull on as far as like at the mixing desk and so on. Not much, because this was still quite early. Producers were still getting used to how to actually capture death metal. But yeah, The Red in the Sky is Ours is it stands out both in At the Gates' discography and Swedish death metal for that reason as well. Yeah, so Tyler, what are your thoughts on this?
I don't know, man. It just doesn't sound enough like Morbid Visions for me to really get into it. Um, anyway, it is an excellent album, and I do enjoy listening to it from time to time. But Roman will be pleased to hear, and I mentioned this to Shelley also, that over the years I've definitely shifted more to a preference for Gardens of Grief than The Red in the Sky is Ours, and there's reasons for that. As Shelley mentioned, there's a sense in which the kind of mythos of death metal is more understated on this album, I feel. Uh, there's an element in heavy metal of using fantasy as a means of explicating the rules of power in a natural environment in order to emphasize to the listener the idea that contrast in life is not only necessary, but something worthy of awe in itself for how it at for how for the how do I want to put this, for the excitement that it brings to life, for the purpose that it bestows upon you, for the sense of meaning that it can provide. And so it kind of teaches you this idea of embracing the place of conflict, of aggression, of darkness, of negativity. And death metal kind of relies on a mythological symbolism in order to communicate this. This album, I feel, doesn't necessarily have that. And sometimes that mythos, as I'm explaining it, is communicated through ways that maybe are aesthetic more so, in the kind of unsettling nature of the riffs that you hear on Gardens of Grief, for instance, or on other death metal albums that I feel have this element, through the thematic content, through the subject matter of the lyrics, or through the tone, the timbre of vocals, or so on and so forth, but also through like the choice in how melodies progress, and the sort of contrast between one riff or one theme and another. This album kind of is almost an experiment in sorts of creating through composed death metal, where you have almost in ways, not entirely, an almost constant stream of tremolo riffing. And that is a really interesting idea, and in fact, an avenue that I think is a fruitful, if not necessary, one for increasing the true melodicism of extreme metal music. But unfortunately for me, what I would consider a sort of downgrade for this album, and perhaps a slight one, is that is almost what the album is in its entirety. There is like some kind of introspective melancholy that is conveyed, especially in the lyrics and in some of the shapes of the melodies. It has a very sentimental sense of melody, in a way that's not even typical of the kind of melancholic melody that you hear in a lot of Swedish death metal. But really, that's almost a kind of servant of the idea of displaying the musical ability of the members of the band and being able to create this flow that undulates and shifts throughout the course of each piece. And that, like I said, is very interesting, and as I also said, probably necessary. But to me, it loses some of the excitement and some of the kind of world building, as Shelley put it, where you almost feel like you're descending into a nightmarish, fantastical landscape, and the music is an exploration of that.
So I've got a few thoughts on that, but before I express them, I'll let Roman chime in.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that the best way to describe this to me, the difference that I'm thinking immediately, is the freneticism is higher on this album than Gardens of Grief. Gardens of Grief is, I mean, you know, the general howling paranoia of Thomas Lindbergh's growl combined with the various kinds of dissonant writing styles and whatever. It's definitely, I think the word was correct on the that Shelley used on the first one. It's a more muscular on Gardens of Grief, and which I always look at these kind of like Wagnerian abyssal cavernous kind of riffs that come through. Whereas this one is, again, it's more frenetic. It's more spastic, and that kind of goes in with the jazzy elements that we're talking about right here. I mean, you said, well, then we avoided using that term, but at the same time, I mean, like, it just kind of comes through pretty obviously when you get like stuff like, I don't know, the drum patterns in Claws of Laughter Dead, for example, where you get like the flat out like jazz drum break right there. But it still works very well. I think in a certain way this album is much more insane and unhinged than the first one. I like the first one. I guess what I like about the first one is kind of it's a little bit more detached, which I mean, relatively speaking, of course, you can't really call Thomas Lindbergh howling away saying, "Lord of Chaos, let me sleep. All I want is to sleep," etc. You can't call that entirely emotionally detached, but I'm speaking in relative terms right here. Whereas this one's like this very personal, very intense and chaotic by comparison. And I mean, it's just like some of the moments are just, well, you can point out some very obvious ones, like in the song, for example, Through Gardens of Grief, where everything just stops, and then there's the drums and the violin, and it's like it's like all of a sudden somebody died, and there's a funeral procession, just like smack like that, just comes out of nowhere. And there's, various, like, I mean, you have like more tranquil moments, like, towards the end of Within, which I think might be the best one on the album as far as I'm concerned.
Windows is pretty tranquil track all around as well, I think.
Yes, absolutely. But hang on, what was I gonna get through here though? I think that it's interesting. I did want to say the following about it. And I think Shelley, you might find this interesting. Are you familiar with Thomas Lindbergh's political views? Actually,
no. I know he's a sociology teacher, but I don't know what his.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he basically. Somewhere he actually said more or less that he's an orthodox Marxist. So,
I know he sings in like Dysphere, the hardcore punk band, so that doesn't surprise me. But
yeah. So I it's a kind of funny little thing I think about when I think, the red in the sky is ours. Some people might make a joke.
The communist album.
But yes, I always, one thing I wanted to add about this release was something that I remember reading on a forum post way back, or might have even been it was in a review on Metal Archives, and I always took this to heart very strongly. That there's kind of a concept going through this album. It's and this goes back to the whole thing being very well tightly put together as an album. There is a concept. There does seem to be a narrative. And I mean, the one that I always saw here, and Tyler and I would talk about this actually back in the day, there's kind of a Nietzschean death of God idea going on right here that kind of starts off with the first track and then progresses. I'm talking lyrically. I mean, we're not getting into the musical aspect. That seems to devolve into like just utter total chaos and nihilism, basically the destruction of previous values, but not having the strength to have transvaluated those values, so to speak. So, I mean, I've always found that this album a very interesting exercise in that. And got, just as a side note, with respect to the classical music thing, it was years ago that Tyler pointed out to me that the second half of the first song, "Red in the Sky's Ours," "The Season to Come," that's Michael Pretorius, a great Baroque composer. That's actually a piece by him right there. It's not credited on the album as such, but if anybody was ever curious about that, yeah, that's a Michael Pretorius piece, and he's really good, and you should check him out.
Just wanted to add a little something back to what Tyler said, and Roman also touched on that when he spoke about the emotionality of the compositions. And when Tyler talked about I think he brings an important point that I forgot to add, which is how sentimental some of the songs here sound, some of the certain melodies sound here, which is indeed something very atypical for death metal, I think. And well, that really touches a bit on what I was saying about the album being, despite this inherent brutality and the agony and despair that is obviously present, there's also a lot of elegance and beauty to it. And also, I think part of that comes from how like blatantly emotional some of it is, and I think this leads nicely into the next album because I think that they further emphasize that on With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness. I think there are more conventional. It's a more conventionally melodic album compared to the first, and it also uh, plays a bit heavily on this more sentimental, more emotional, almost emo content, but in a good way though.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the many reasons why I love this album, because there were so few death metal bands willing to toy with this territory, because it is dangerous territory as far as like not coming off as really sentimental or like trite in a certain way, especially with this form of music. But in a lot of ways, it's also a shame that this wasn't sort of built on in a more sophisticated way. Um, I just also wanted to come in on Tyler's point around like the fact that it is literally a constant sort of stream of melody, and I quite. What's one of the reasons why I like this album, like to characterize this album as very, very experimental and progressive, in the literal sense of those words, rather than sort of the way they're kind of understood today. And I do keep drawing the comparison with something like Unquestionable Presence, in terms of the fact that it's not like an all-rounder. It's not like an Onward to Golgotha or even a Blessed of the Sick, where you just think this is what death metal is, and it hits all of those beats and it does it really, really well. But also ends up crafting its own unique identity at the same time. The Red in the Sky is Ours does something very, very specific, and I imagine that's probably why Jason doesn't vibe with it quite so much, because it's not trying to be a quote unquote death metal album. It is trying to use death metal as a genre and its techniques to express something very, very weird, very, very niche. And I think Roman pointed to some of that with the sort of the unpacking of the concept. And in a previous episode, again unrelated to this, I think it was like 1998 Extreme Metal Tier List that we were doing, and we were talking about the Blazebirth Hall Russian black metal bands and how they pretty much just, particularly Branicald and Forest, they just do a constant tremolo riff with basic but very, very elegant melodies over the top. And it's something that I find really, really compelling and hypnotic, and I keep returning to. But Tyler, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but he kind of said that whilst he appreciates that, he likes the ambiguity of adding that atonality back in from, say, like an early Graveland or something like that, because it lends it. I think this is what Tyler means when he keeps pointing to this mythos. It lends it that extra kind of dimension. And whilst I can understand that point to some extent, again, I would point to a track like Within that starts almost like one of the Peaceville 3. It could be a My Dying Bride riff that it opens with, and then it goes very, very frenetic, very urgent, almost like Lawless at some points, with just these chaotic little choppy riffs, and then it slowly like unfolds back into, as what you said, Raphael, it's almost beautiful, and then this violin comes in and it almost sounds triumphant, but it never quite reaches for the light, but it does really kind of it achieves that sense of emotional catharsis that I think basically most of post-metal is trying to make their entire career out of, but At the Gates managed it in just the 2-minute finale, where you just get this emotional release. But again, it does it with such a sense of like restraint and dignity that's so rare in this form of music. And I think that's just one example of one of the sort of many ways this album sort of toys with your expectations. And yeah, they throw every like technique, including the kitchen sink, at you, but it always kind of brings it back around to a place where it all makes sense again. And that's one of the things I really do love about it. Does anyone else have anything to add on this album before we move on?
Not really, but what I was just interested because sorry, I had to step away for a moment. What was the general consensus after I gave my piece on it?
I think the general consensus is that you and Roman are on roughly the same page as far as being very, very appreciative of this album, but not ranking it as highly as Gardens of Grief. Whereas Raphael and I think we're all agreeing on the same features of this album and what makes it utterly unique. It's just that Raphael and I think we just value it, value those features a little bit more than you two. Although, stop me if I'm wrong.
Okay, yeah, I can understand that. Did always feel that this album was far more up your alley, and obviously especially Raphael's alley than it is mine. It used to be one of my absolute favorites. It's just over the years my tastes kind of shifted somewhat.
Yeah. Well, yeah. As Raphael's already hinted at it, we might as well move on. So they expanded their sound and the length of their album titles with Fear I Kissed the Burning Darkness. And as I mentioned on this album, again recorded at Sunlight Studio, so Studio Sunlight. Sorry, so it does sonically, it's much more aligned with their contemporaries. They've even got like the buzzsaw tone going on here, a bit of like Entombed Dismember sort of style. You get a fatter production. Although Lindbergh's vocals are still pretty kind of wild, they are much more kind of recognizably restrained and death metal at this point. On the predecessor, they were kind of their own thing, and then here you get a much more refined style. And as Raphael mentioned, the melody is much more recognizably what we call melodic death metal. I would say the style is actually almost pretty much there in terms of what they would become on Slaughter of the Soul, whereas the difference here is that they are still letting these melodic tangents kind of define the direction of each track, and they still go off on these bizarre, dense, often uncomfortable deviations, whereas Slaughter of the Soul, they just package them into neat little cycles that fit into basically what is a pop song, so they become licks rather than actually melodies. We'll come to that. But on this, I really, really love this album. It took me a long time to get into it. After The Red in the Sky Is Ours, I did feel like it was a bit of a step down because it is so much more typical, but at the same time, it's still way weirder than a lot of like aesthetically comparable albums. You know, your Dark Tranquilities and your In Flames were kind of getting going by this point, and they were much more basically just leveraging the furniture of Swedish death metal and injecting those poppy melodies in. Whereas At the Gates was still quite jarring and weird on this album, and I kind of like the fact that fans of like modern melodic death metal will go back to this as one of the kind of formative albums, and they might be sorely disappointed because it is dense and it is challenging. Even like the opening bars to Beyond Good and Evil, the first track, you get what sounds like it's going to be a very typical riff that you'd find on Slaughter of the Soul, this da 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 da, but then they just stop and go dudum dudum and just completely cut out the momentum, and then they just keep hammering that kind of technique home, where you kind of feel like they're going to move into something quite lyrical and easy to follow, and then the rhythm will just cut out or it'll just do something completely different. And I really love those little moments where it behaves like a poppy death metal album to trick you, and then when it reveals its true self, it becomes far more like complex and bizarre. But yeah, as Raphael mentioned as well, they go much more they're not afraid to be quite emotional again on this album. I mean, it's there in the title as well, in a way that is still managing to achieve a sense of tastefulness, a sense of sort of sophistication to it. So yeah, it's one of the great oddballs of like death metal that was just past its peak. So we're in 1993 by this point, but I rank it up there as like this is when death metal was really flying in all directions, and artists were trying to just take it in any direction they could possibly find. Some of them succeeded, some of them not so much. This is one of these great little deviations that I just love to return to as like an archetype of melodic death metal. So I will hand to Tyler first this time around.
This album is not only more streamlined, perhaps in just the approach to music overall, it's also more compact in comparison to their prior material, and that only about half of the album is good. Sorry. The first half of the album has more decent songwriting than the latter half of the album. I feel on the latter half of the album, what Shelley was saying about hearing what would become Slaughter of the Soul is very apparent, because they start to utilize a certain speed or thrash metal technique of having a single chord that they ride through various rhythmic permutations, which is one of the most boring forms of riffing. I know that there are plenty of bands like Blood, for instance, that do a form of budget riffing where there is like a 1 to 2 chord riff that they do kind of rhythmic work with. But those bands use that transitionally. They don't use it as a sort of major theme in the song, which is what At the Gates starts doing on this record. Already being someone who has some problems with The Red in the Sky Is Ours, hearing an album that is The Red in the Sky Is Ours, but with a more streamlined sense of melody, is unappetizing for me. There are moments on the album where I think that's a very unique and very refined approach to melody. But unfortunately for me, it never, and this is a criticism I levy a lot, I know, reaches a level of profundity that I hear in what I consider the best of death metal. So at most, my summary of this release is that you hear the beginning of fragmentation here that would only become more apparent with subsequent releases.
I mean, okay, yeah, I definitely agree the second half is the inferior portion of the album, and I'll also say I appreciate this album more on an intellectual level, because I like this form of melodic death metal. Whenever I hear the term melodic death metal, I think that sounds amazing. Like the development of The Red in the Sky Is Ours, this album, and so on. And it is such a shame that because this same year Carcass released Heartwork, and it's just a shame that it became more that, which is basically a way to do pop music with essentially recycled new album riffs and the furniture, as I said, of some death metal and like thrash riffs in there. But what I really like about this album is it hints at the possibility of something slightly different, something a bit more deviational, very, very fluid. But I say all this knowing full well it is not perfect. I find this a frustrating album to listen to, and I keep returning to it because I think there is great value in that. But I think I tend to have more patience than you, Tyler, with like failed experiments or things that just don't come off, but you could kind of appreciate what they were doing, and I do take great joy from that as well. And I do make a point of trying to listen to this without having the idea in my mind of what At the Gates were to become just a couple of years later. But yeah, sorry, I've already spoken too long, so I will hand to Roman next.
Yeah, sorry, I was just fiddling with the mute button right there. Okay, there's a lot of interesting things to say about this. I guess I'll start off with, just so I can clear the record on this, I mean, in case it was ever in doubt with anybody, At the Gates is always been one of my favorite bands ever, and that includes Red in the Sky Is Ours. And as much as I have a preference for with Fear, as much as I have a preference for Gardens of Grief over Red in the Sky Is Ours, it's like we're talking about like A versus S. At that point, it's a very close gap. With an album like with Fear, I Kiss the Burning Darkness, that gap is getting much larger. Now, it's an interesting thing here because this was listening to it, looking back at the song titles, at the album artwork and all of that, and just remembering all the riffs, it gets me very nostalgic for being in high school because that's when I listened to this. And I guess there's a certain degree to which the melancholy and certain things on this album, play into the angst of that time period. So there's definitely, I definitely have a very high nostalgia factor for this album. I think a lot of the assessments that have been said previously are very correct. I think it's well known at this point that the first half of this album is much better than the second half. By the time you get to the second half, you're getting all these you're getting these junk throwaway riffs that basically come in. The writing gets lazier would be my main criticism. Obviously, it's heightening and emphasizing the emotional and personal aspects of the previous album. Which is another thing, which I mean, it's very good at doing that. Actually, we can argue objectively what is better art, and what do you really want from it at the end of the day. Like, do you want something that's more just like a personal emotional experience, or do you want something that's more detached and looking at something a little bit more transcendental? I think this definitely, as I said, leans more in the personal emotional aspect of things. And I mean, the melodies on this and the counterpoints particularly are absolutely beautiful in so many different parts of the album. Like the second song, and even in the Break of Autumn has some great parts to it too. And the lyrics, there's a lot of this. I mean, they're just poetry sometimes. Some of the lyrics on this album, it definitely goes back to the personal thing I was talking about right there. I think the highlight of this one for me is Primal Breath. I think that's up there with some of the best material that At the Gates has ever done. It's the second riff that comes in that song after they've been looping that first riff for a while. There's the second one that comes in, and there's just something about the harmony and the counterpoint there. I've always thought to myself, it sounded like it should have been arranged for strings. And there's a lot of moments like that on this album. Even though it's on the second half, the song "The Burning Darkness" has actually some really good counterpoint in there as well. And yeah, there is good stuff on the second half. It's just I feel like the songwriting just gets a little bit lazier there. Anyways, that's kind of all over the place, but I do really like this album. It's just I wouldn't rate it as highly as the first two, and by a long stretch, and it's definitely both you and Tyler are correct on this in the sense that you can definitely see the beginnings of the Slaughter of the Soul, the more speed metal thrash riffing that's coming in there that they kind of get lazy with putting into the songs later on. But it's also the exact the much more personal, melancholic, relatable emotionalism that's going on here is exactly what kind of goes into what you were talking about, is this being like a melodic death metal album proper, in the sense of Melodeath as we know it. And it's a much better example of all that stuff than comes later. I mean, it blows like, come on, you compare this to Dark Tranquillity Skydancer, which came out the same year, and there's no comparison. This beats it by like leaps and bounds, and quite frankly, pretty much anything in that genre. But it's obviously much more identifiable as being part of that genre than anything they did before this.
Yeah, I was also going to mention Primal Breath, just in response to Tyler as well, in terms of like how I mean, it feels like it could have been written for the preceding album, to be honest, because it is that sophisticated and that like hypnotic to listen to. But yeah, that's why it's such a sort of conflicted album, is because you get moments like that, but then yeah, as we've mentioned, you do get stuff on the second half that is, as you said, sort of throwaway. And I wonder, because a lot of this hinges on Al Svensson and the fact that he was such a formative part of At the Gates at this time, and obviously his departure was the beginning of this dramatic decline. So one wonders if maybe he was sort of already checking out by this point, and by the time they were writing the second half, maybe he'd already sort of taken a back seat, maybe. But I also think the interesting thing to note about this album is it is kind of neglected by the quote-unquote purists precisely for the reasons that we've already been mentioning. You get the start of like later Melodeath in there, but it's also rejected by the fans of like the poppier end of extreme metal because it's still absurdly sophisticated at times, and it is quite a dense, challenging album to listen to. Sorry, I've gone off on one again, but Raphael, what are your thoughts on this? Yay or nay?
Well, I agree, especially with what you were saying. I think for this album, they dialed back a little bit on the complexity and the weird melody shapes, and added and went a bit further in terms of melody and especially more conventional melody. But it's still, as you were saying, it's still a very unique album by all means, and I think that in a perfect world, this would be melodic death metal. What we call melodic death metal would refer to something like this and more albums a bit like this, at least in terms of spirit. Yeah, I think it's despite being, as I was saying, as we were all saying, very very melodic and even catchy in some ways. It's still, I think it has everything, all of the idiosyncrasies that made the preceding work very good and very unique. I think the songs are still, even though they're, as I was saying, even though they are kind of catchy at times, they still have, as you were saying, they still have a lot of sophistication, a lot of, it's still very immersive from a world building point of view. Again, the lyrics are excellent. Even the song titles on this one are excellent, I believe. And the combination of that with the music and then the album cover, the artwork, really makes for quite an interesting experience, I think. So yeah, I think for me, this one is almost as good as The Red in the Sky. It's not quite as good, but still very much top tier for me. So yeah, I think afterwards was when the band started to decline. I would say, like, in my book, the next album is still acceptable, I think, but yeah, and that's the best way I can put it. It's acceptable, but yeah, I think this was the last great At the Gates album in my opinion.
Yeah, but for as dense and sophisticated as parts of it can be, Shelley and Raphael, the real question is it really any bit as good as Morbid Visions? I don't know. I don't know if it really approaches that.
I mean, you know, I love bass like primitivism as much as the next guy. Like, I love Mere Blood. I love Early Carcass. Some of them are my favorite albums. But I also do like it when artists try something, even if they don't utterly succeed or sometimes they even fail. I appreciate what they were trying to do on this album. It's just that it doesn't quite come off in the way that one would have hoped, I think.
I just want to let you know, for context, and to ride this bit until it's completely dead, that I have a copy of Morbid Visions in every room of my house.
Just as Jason does with Altars of Madness, I'm sure. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. I think, yeah, so we've been hinting at this a lot in terms of like the Alf Svensson of it all and the fact that after the things really did take a tumble. But I definitely concur with Raphael in the fact that Terminal Spirit Disease is not a terrible album. I mean, it really should have been an EP, let's be clear on that. It's not very long and there's like 3 live tracks at the end of it. But it is the first album without Svensson, and the decline hadn't quite set in yet. There was still some of that residual influence there that I think kind of rubbed off on them. So Terminal Spirit Disease is a step down. Don't get me wrong. You kind of get the sense that this is the archetypical like transitional album. I think of like Voivod's Killing Technology. You think of Terminal Spirit Disease as like they still have. They're at least trying to make a show of being vaguely sophisticated in some way, and they're at least trying to compose songs that elevate the riffs in some way, rather than just being a kind of showcase for very, very, very sugary sweet licks and kind of easy to follow grooves. Terminal Spirit Disease has some jagged edges around it, but it is very much the forerunner to what was to become Melodeath at this time. So yeah, I don't have too much else to say on it. Does anyone have any thoughts on Terminal Spirit Disease?
Yeah, I can say a few things about it. So I'll say this first off. Something I forgot to say about it with Furicus the Burning Darkness that I'll say here in relation to this one. I mean, it's very surface and aesthetic or whatever, but I'll be honest, I've never really liked the production on with Furicus the Burning Darkness. I always felt there was something wrong with it. The guitar sounded too tinny. Sometimes stuff sounded like it was being played through a telephone or like with radio interference or something. I don't know. I was not a fan of the production on that album, but you know, at a certain point, you just kind of accept those things because the music's good. And, you know, it kind of adds to the charm. It's kind of like, I always like to use the example of Early Absurd, even though it's played absolutely horribly. The music, I like the early versions of their songs better than what they did when they re-recorded them later. I felt they lost some of the charm in the process of that. So anyways, in this case, I mean, I'll say very funny. Yes, it's obviously a very modern production by comparison to the previous one, but I'll give it credit even just for that. I'll give it credit for the guitar tone and everything sounding better this time around because I just didn't like with Furicus the Burning Darkness on that level too much. What I'll say is that this is very much, yes, Melodeath proper. It's getting more into fundamentally the poppy territory or like, you know, the mainstream rock territory. But to be honest, like the one thing I'll say is like because these songs are still in the early stage of them making that transition, they're good at it. They're good at it on this release. Like, you know, all these songs have some moments where it comes together, and you know, it's not. I mean, we've fallen far from Gardens of Grief, Red in the Sky is Ours, or with Furicus the Burning Darkness, but like, yeah, it's basically just good at making catchy music on this one. And they still have some very beautiful melodies that come up. But you're definitely in the realm of like, this is personal music. This is very, you know, the teen angst. Well, I used to love this when I was like 14, 15, man. So like, you're definitely listening to it in that kind of context when you're growing up. Also, what the heck is going on in that album cover? I don't know what that's even supposed to be. To this day, I have no idea. And you could tell that things were going to go. Things weren't going well when they changed the logo too. Like
I was just about to mention that.
Well, there you go. At any rate, I guess the very short answer I would give on this is like, this is kind of what Slaughter of the Soul should have been. It's very clearly that style, but they actually were able to write good, like they were able to write songs in that style that transcended like, you know, just the standard verse chorus, mainstream stuff. So this one, I'd probably give it like a C minus. That's probably what I'd say. And that might even be on a good day. But it's not a fail. It's not a fail by any stretch.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I would say.
Before I just quickly on the logo before I hand off to Raphael, we did mention this on the Immortal episode as well in terms of like when they changed the logo, they changed the style dramatically, and you kind of just wish they'd changed the name of the band entirely. But yeah, the fact that the old logo kind of looks like stained glass windows, it's the same sort of contours and stuff, and then the new logo just looks like a skater brand or something. It's definitely a red flag as to, you know, what you're getting into. But yeah, Raphael, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I already said, well, pretty concisely what I think about this album, but well, yeah, basically, I think that what happened was they found out that the melodic beats on their previous albums, or the fact that they had this sensibility and this knack for music that could sound pretty reasonably catchy at times. So basically, they realized that they could cash in on it, and so they stripped off the music of everything that made it really good, and just focused on making these really like concentrating completely on these catchy beats. But the thing is that on this album, it's still relatively acceptable. There are still good riffs sometimes. There are interesting decisions at times, and that's what really sets this apart from further albums. Yeah.
Tyler?
Terminal Spirit Disease is terminally boring. Um, Anyhow, it really doesn't sound too different to me from what bands like Carcass were doing at the time. Which
I think it's better than
was
Carcass.
okay. It could be better than Carcass, but it's a similar approach, I think, in that um, they're reintegrating heavy metal influences into the music, and perhaps it's in a misguided attempt to uh, trim the fat, reducing unnecessary complexity to try to approach pure expressiveness. But all too often, when bands get to the return to their influences stage, really what they end up doing is imitating past successes rather than exploring new and exciting territory. And while I can say that the melodicism on this release is enjoyable in and of itself, it has no context. It has no architecture that it's contained within that makes it something that I would want to listen to repeatedly. That would be a very important album to me in the grand scheme of music. I can enjoy it on the same level that I enjoy maybe the occasional 80s pop song where they actually have some modicum of ability for writing a decent melody rather than entirely relying on a catchy rhythmic hook. Um, and that's the same level on which I enjoy, shocker here, Heartwork by Carcass. But that being said, I say that, and that's not an endorsement. I don't think that it's quality music that you absolutely need to listen to, essential in any way. In fact, quite the opposite. You are not missing anything by never listening to this. If you do hear it, it has a nice sense of melody to it. It can be enjoyable. It's not offensive. It's not doing anything outright stupid. But it's also not doing anything to commend it to anything other than just being a decent, enjoyable melody to listen to. So I guess that I could say it's better than the next release in the context of history and of this band's career, but I really feel like that's a pretty low bar. I don't know how much of a compliment that really is.
Yeah, So I was listening to Carcass and Arch Enemy when I was young, as like my formative gateway into this. By Carcass, I mean Heartwork era stuff, and obviously At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, and then going back to earlier At the Gates, very very soon afterwards. I think that's where some of my opinions on an album like With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness were formed. In that I recognise the melodic shapes, but they, for my unattuned ears, they're all jumbled up and in very confusing configurations, and it takes many, many listens to sort of unpack what they're doing. Whereas on Terminal Spirit Disease, you get the start of what that pop P mellow death thing would become, which is basically repackaging what can be at times quite interesting and well written melodic flourishes, but packaged in such a way that you can easily digest it in very, very conventional pop structures and so on. And I think that's the real kind of crime that we keep pointing our finger at here, to be honest. I don't know, Roman, did you want to come in on that?
Well, apparently, it's funny. I'm reading through stuff right here, and apparently they literally said they wanted to write simpler, more rock-based songs around the time of this album. So they literally just said it themselves. I was gonna laugh too because I was actually expecting Tyler to say when he said the album title, I thought he was gonna say it's like this album has terminal spirit disease. I was expecting something like that in the sense of like the decline of the band.
I mean, it's true. It's an apt title.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of ironic in that sense. Yeah, no, that was pretty much all I wanted to chime in with there. I can't. Nothing else I really wanted to say. I do agree with Tyler. It's not essential. You're not missing anything by not hearing it. Like it's relevant to probably some of us because it was kind of part of the process of getting to where we got to in listening to metal, and picking it up when you're a teenager and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's like it's trust me, I do kind of enjoy some parts of it and listening to it every once in a while. But yeah, it's certainly not essential and definitely not something I would put that out there to be like, yeah, everybody should listen to this and imitate this sound and there should be more of it. I would not exactly say that.
It's not annoying.
Yes.
But yeah, so obviously we've already been sort of de facto talking about Slaughter of the Soul in some of this discussion, and I do keep drawing parallels to Carcass in this because in many ways Slaughter of the Soul is like the equivalent, at the gates equivalent to an album like Heartwork. And I think there's a documentary on YouTube about Carcass. I think it was made after they reformed in the mid 2000s, where they outright said they considered Heartwork their peak because they managed to basically find a way to package Iron Maiden riffs within a faster death metal setting, with more sophisticated quote unquote melodies.
That's not an accomplishment.
Well, yeah, and then they said they didn't really know where to take their sound after that, and they ended up with an album like Swan Song, which was, let's take it even further back to Led Zeppelin instead. But yeah, that's where the minds of these people were at the time. And to your point, Tyler, it was very much them thinking, well, we've accidentally created this beast, this monster. We've been very, very formative to the formation of extreme metal. I don't really know what to do now. So what kind of music did I like as a kid? Well, I really liked new wave of British heavy metal bands. I really liked classic rock in the case of like Bill Steer or something. For At the Gates, it was very much that combination. And I'm not going to rip Slaughter of the Soul to shreds because I think that horse has been beaten. But there is a sense in which they were the best at this style. Like, there's a reason this album is considered a watershed within, like, pop metal, as it were. Because, as Roman alluded to with Terminal Spirit Disease, I think At the Gates did it better than most of the other bands out there. But in some ways, that's like me saying that, I don't know, like, a serial killer is better at murdering someone. Like that, it's not something to be praised. It's something to be criticized for. It's like doing a terrible style really, really well kind of just means that the airwaves are kind of taken up with this god-awful style and all of these bands want to imitate it. And I was just out of curiosity, I was watching the video for, what was the single off this album? I think it was like the first track, Blinded by Fear, where they recorded a video for it. And I was just reading the comments on YouTube, and loads of them were saying like they were modern metalcore fans or whatever, and they did not realize that this style went all the way back to the mid-90s and so on. And I was just like, okay, it's great that, because we all have our gateways, we all have our embarrassing bands, especially when we're younger and we weren't around in the late 80s, early 90s and so on to sort of see it all unfold. We have these embarrassing bands that we liked when we were young, but also it's the fact that this sort of normalized that poppiness within extreme metal, where it made the songs very, very predictable. It made all of the bands need to sort of coat everything in sugar to make it digestible. It made it very, very slick, very, very just homogenized and packaged, and then out of this you get bands like, well, what followed, The Haunted, you get Arch Enemy and things, where it's like it's a step up from new metal as far as what the sort of ambition. And whilst that might not sound that damning in and of itself, when you think about what we were just discussing with Gardens of Grief or Red in the Sky is Ours, it's quite a drop in quality. So yeah, it's just a remarkable little cultural moment in the mid-90s. But yeah, does anyone want to chime in with anything?
As much as I love Slayer and think that they're amazing, I have learned that anytime a band says that what they're trying to make something as compact and furious as Rain and Blood, that it's going to be a travesty. It's going to be a disaster. And that album, Rain and Blood, is a good album. My least favorite of the good Slayer albums, but a good album. But it is a curse upon its name that every band that has tried to imitate that album has produced garbage. And At the Gates is one of those bands that specifically cited that album when talking about writing and recording Slaughter of the Soul. And you can hear in some sense how they were trying to imitate that approach with this record. But interestingly enough, a condemnation I have of this album is that when looking at music as a whole, there's nothing truly memorable about it. They have some of that signature At the Gates approach to melody, to coloring of melody, but they've definitely sanitized it to make it something easily digestible. And I think that even as much influence as it had on part of the early metalcore movement, specifically the part that was more so imitating heavy metal rather than hardcore, with groups like Killswitch Engage and Avenged Sevenfold and Darkest Hour and groups like that, that just wholesale lifted riffs from this album pretty much. As much influence as it had on those groups, and those groups went on to have a massive influence upon the development of metalcore, even on the development of pop punk and emo and deathcore and all the cross influences that those genres have had with each other. If you talk to fans of the latest developments of those music today, a large number of them have no idea about the existence of this album, of Slaughter of the Soul. As many that did know about it in the early days of metalcore, there's almost none of the contemporary fans who have any idea about this album, any idea that it exists, or of the influence it had on the music that they listen to, that you can still hear in the music they listen to, which I feel is a testament to the fact that it is a forgettable album.
I think a lot of the comments were alluding to that as well, and saying, despite the fact that this is an enormous album, and it's one of the reasons why At the Gates became such a household name, I don't think if they had not released this album, I think they would have remained quite an obscure underground band on the sort of level of like a Demolich or something, known to the death metal crowd who are very much embroiled in that universe, but in terms of like the wider metal community, it would have remained obscure. But it's interesting that, again, if you talk about gradations of people in the know, for want of a better term, then when you step outside of like metal proper into the mellow metalcore fans, your Trivium fans and your Avenged Sevenfold fans, then it's remarkable that they haven't heard of this album. And also, just briefly before I hand off to Raphael, the thing this album reminds me of is, I can't remember the name of the album, but there was like a trend, I think, in the 70s of taking famous refrains from classical music and putting it over disco beats. And I think there was even like a lot of videos made of like women doing disco dancing to it. And it would take like a refrain from like Beethoven's Fifth and just put it over a disco beat. And there was a raging debate within classical music about the fact that this was blasphemy, and it was like dumbing down a very sophisticated form of music and taking only the most like well-known, recognizable phrases completely out of context. And then there was the other side, which was saying, well, yeah, it is doing that, but it's also introducing fans to something more sophisticated. It's like, it's a gateway, and we talk about this a lot. But Slaughter of the Soul kind of does that in a lot of ways. It lifts melodies that could have been on their previous albums, but just places them in a totally contextless place with a very solid, like headbangable groove underneath, and then a very kind of predictable structure, and it kind of it does a similar thing. So yeah, Raphael, do you have any thoughts on the decline?
Yeah, well, I don't think I have anything like very many good things to say about this album. Although I guess I agree with what you said about it being the best within this style, and also it has the merit of being the merit or the demerit of being the founding fathers of this style. Well, in any case, I haven't really spent much time with this album because the few times I've listened to it, I remember the very first time I listened to it, I found it really bad. But I know I am fully aware that that feeling was partly because I knew and liked very much what they had done before, and so by comparison, it seemed not just very different, but also like a really sharp decline in terms of quality. But yeah, I guess it's within that type of thing, as you were saying, it's probably relatively good, I guess, in context, in that context. And yeah, I think that there's still something about that decades, and this also extends up to their later albums, even like the more recent albums they released. I've given them a listen, and I think you can see it's relatively different from any band or just any like mediocre modern band. You can see that the band that has talent and has good ideas. It's just that they're doing mediocre material, but you can see a certain spark there that would not be present in just the average band, I guess. And yeah, I guess that also applies to Slaughter of the Soul. I guess if I were to listen to the album today, for example, I would probably find here and there a few things that stand out. Maybe, well, I remember that song. One of the songs that I think I found not as bad was Cold, and I guess there are some interesting things here and there. But yeah, overall, I think the consensus on this album is very clear among us. Yeah, I completely agree with it.
Hmm. Yeah, Roman, anything to add?
Yeah. So first off, I mean, not anything substantially different from what's been said before, but one thing I will say is, just the disco with classical samples over it, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. I actually, me and Kevin, formerly Cromlech, but now Mormcgill, Kevin would always talk about this, and I agree with him that one of the worst things that ever happened with certain parts of classical music is that they were used in commercials. In the '90s, like you had these beautiful pieces of music that everybody associates them with, like stupid comedic scenes at this point from movies, like Ode to Joy. There are people that like the end of Beethoven's Ninth is supposed to be this like profound transcendental experience, but whenever anybody hears that, all they can think of is like funny, contrasting, ironic scenes from movies where like something's like, like there's something funny happening there, and all of a sudden, like, Beethoven's Ninth is playing over the top, or, how much music has been ruined by, the associations it's gotten with just like stupid stuff in commercials. I think that was definitely disco music having classical samples is probably a bad thing at the end of the day. And the same thing with that. It's like, I don't know if anybody's ever checked out classical music because because it was in a disco song or it was in a commercial. Now, that being said, in contradiction to that, I do know about At the Gates because they got popular, and they got popular because of this album. So I will definitely agree with that at the very least. The other thing I'll say is that in terms of them being the best at doing their style, I'll repeat what I said. I think they did it the best. I think the best example they did of this style was Terminal Spirit Disease. So this album to me is just a complete write-off. It's probably one of the worst things that's ever been recorded. It's like
Worse than Saint Anger.
Okay, fair. I guess at least unlike Saint Anger, it doesn't loop the same song 2 or 3 times. So I guess it's got that going for it. But it was funny because I was thinking about the Haunted during this, and this is just a funny anecdote. I was in a group chat once where a bunch of us were joking about liking the Haunted, and somebody actually left because of that. Because they hated the Haunted so much that they couldn't even take the joke. So, Charles, I know you'll never listen to this, but that was funny. Anyways,
Well,
The
speaking of the
Metallica
Haunted,
comparison is apt. Go on, Shelley.
no, I was just going to say, speaking of the Haunted, I do actually own two of their albums because I never throw out metal CDs, and again, they were like one of the very, very early bands that I got into in the early 2000s. Because again, it was like bands similar to Carcass or whatever, and then you go Out the Gates, and then you go Arch Enemy, and then the Haunted comes up on most searches as well. And that's pretty much what happened. So At the Gates split after Slaughter of the Soul, not too long after, and most of the members joined the Haunted, which were like, I mean, you don't need me to describe it to you, but like, yeah, melodic thrash is what they're billed as, but it's very bratty metal, like a step above something like Hatebreed or something. And this is one of the what I was alluding to in the opening remarks on At the Gates. It's one of the reasons they are such a confusing prospect within death metal, because okay, you take a band like, say, Morbid Angel, where they have a very obvious decline. They have a brief, like, experimental lurch, and then kind of a collapse around the time they released Heretic, where it's kind of clear that they've run out of road as far as like they can take their style and need to take a hiatus. Someone like At the Gates, they have this very, very early peak in the debut EP and album, and then everything else after that is just lurching from one way or another to kind of recapture the magic. And we can talk about like Al Svensson and his role in the early At the Gate sound as well, but they weren't solo albums, and we've already mentioned like Lindbergh's incredible lyrics and vocals as well, and they're absolutely key to that. The percussion as well, the drumming is sensational, but again it gets slowly more and more linear as like the 90s progressed. But yeah, At the Gates, they really do encapsulate in many ways the decline, especially of Swedish or Northern European metal, from this quite sort of sophisticated, drab, gothic, I hesitate to use the word, sorry Jason, but neoclassical kind of iteration of extreme metal into this very, very poppy, populist form. And the Haunted that followed At the Gates are basically the nadir of that. And then obviously everyone kind of washed themselves down, and by the late 2000s, you had bands like Asphyx putting out new material. You had Autopsy reforming and putting out new material. You had a number of others kind of just trying to recapture the old magic. And then after a little bit of teasing, At the Gates were a little bit late to the day with reforming and putting out new material. I know they did a few tours before that, but then they did At War of Reality. And I totally forgot they did two more albums after that. We're not going to unpack them all individually because I don't think there's enough substance to really go into that. But they also released To Drink from the Night Itself and The Nightmare of Being, keeping up the ridiculously long album titles. And I'm less familiar with these albums. I did listen to them when they came out, and I got the same impression I got as the Carcass Reformation albums, particularly Surgical Steel, where they're trying to mash together their most popular tropes, basically. Something that will make them look a little bit legitimate, but also hit all those beats as far as like recapturing the Slaughter of the Soul magic. And I know that the latest album, The Nightmare of Being, because that is like basically a diminishing returns process. The Nightmare of Being, they tried to introduce prog elements, but when I say prog, I really mean they add some time signatures, some light jazz, and just all of these sort of flourishes that you'd expect from those kind of poppy prog bands like Later Enslaved and Opeth and things like that. And yeah, but it really does kind of smack of desperation by this point. And it is a shame because I have seen them live a few times, and you will mostly get stuff off these albums, majority Slaughter of the Soul, and if you're lucky they'll play Kingdom Gone or something. So yeah, they're one of these. There's many kind of bands that you lament their downfall over the years, but I don't think there's anyone that's kind of been quite so dramatic and weird and disjointed as At the Gates. So does anyone have anything to add on these later albums?
Oh, sorry, you go ahead, Tyler.
Now, I was going to argue that, talking particularly about the Nightmare of Being, I think it's not that this is too difficult. I think it's better than Slaughter of the Soul. Uh,
What?
yeah, I think it's better than Slaughter
I
of the
can't
Soul
fucking stand that album.
because of the progressive elements that you mentioned. I would say that it hits the quality, or at least comes close to the quality of some of the better 70s progressive rock. And my problem with that style of music, and why I think extreme metal is an advancement on it, extreme metal at its best anyway, is that the progression in better progressive rock and on the Nightmare of Being is a kind of self symbolic progression, in that you largely have progression in the realm of technique, which includes things like you mentioned, Shelley, time signatures or different riffing styles or different chord shapes. Sometimes that can be used very annoyingly to create a sort of carnival effect where you have a lot of different styles being cycled through in order to create a sense of disorientation, which I don't really feel like the Nightmare of Being falls into. It does have at least some schemata for the development in its pieces. That's not to say it's a good album at all. Once again, like Terminal Spirit Disease, you're not missing out by not hearing it. You don't need to go listen to it. But it was a slight advancement, in my opinion, upon what they had been doing before.
All right. Well, I want to say, Tyler, you made me just want to listen to it now. So
So fuck you.
now I'm kind of curious. The only thing I was going to add is I was looking through the info on this on Metal Archives, and there's 20 guest musicians on this album. That's
Fucking hell. I heard there was a saxophone on there, but 20 guest musicians.
saxophone. Okay, now I have to listen to it. Oh, there's a tuba too. Oh man. Okay, I got to check this out now.
I mean, I despise it for those very reasons, a little bit like I despise Late Enslaved, in that you're hearing fragments of a music that you used to love, but as Tyler mentioned, the carnival aspect comes through. But yeah, I'm going to have to revisit it now because Tyler's kind of given it a little plug. I know you're not endorsing the album.
That was totally the.
I am not endorsing the album. I just thought it was a slight step up. There's also a cello, there's a bassoon, there's a clarinet, there's a flute, there's a viola, violin, organ. So, you know, they really went all out. One of my least favorite tricks in extreme metal is tricking you into thinking it's doing something different by including a non-conventional instrument. But yeah, it's like I said, just a slight step up from what they were doing before, which is nice. It's also kind of damning with faint praise because, you know, if the best that can be said about you is, well, it's not as bad as the worst stuff you did, then yeah. But yeah, it was a slight step up. I do feel like you asked the question as bad as Saint Anger earlier. I feel like that's actually a really apt comparison. I feel like the downfall of At the Gates was very similar to the downfall of bands like Metallica, in that they took the best aspects of their music, or the aspects of their music that were most noted, perhaps, and decided to streamline and sanitize those to ride out what possible notoriety they could gain from that. And I think At the Gates kind of went down a similar path. Unlike Metallica, it didn't work out too incredibly well for them because they're not nearly as well remembered, even amongst their, so to speak, successors.
Yeah, Raphael, do you have any light to shed on these albums aside from the ridiculous ensemble that we've just uncovered?
Well, not much, to be honest. As I was already saying, as I already hinted at before, there are some here and there are some interesting things you can pick up from these albums, and I think Tyler sort of went into there as well when he mentioned the more progressive leanings of these albums. But of course, I think these are nice indeed, and that's partially what I meant by some of the more like reminders that he's a good band, a once good band at least, and a talented band. But again, I think those more prog leanings happen on a very superficial level because, as I was saying, I listen to these albums and they're mostly the last album, for example, is follows mostly very simple, like very basic verse chorus structures, which are not bad in themselves. But in this case, I felt it was very like poor in terms of genuine ideas, in terms of structure and or anything just more advanced. Um, I also don't think it's that controversial. Tyler's opinion on it, the last album being better than Salter of the Soul, because for me at least they are more or less. All of these albums are more or less on the same level. So which one is better really will come down to relatively superficial aspects, I guess, like these that I just mentioned. So yeah, that's about as much as I can say about the albums, these later albums.
Yeah, if I could sort of intellectualize my mild defense of Slaughter of the Soul, I would say that there is the nostalgia aspect, but there's plenty of albums that I was listening to at the same time in the early 2000s where I definitely don't return to them, The Haunted being one such example. And I think the reason is because Slaughter of the Soul, as we've kind of hinted at, it still has like fragments of melody that could have been on some of their earlier albums, but here they've been placed completely out of context. But I think I probably do need to return to The Nightmare of Being now, just as an intellectual exercise, because I am curious to unpack just what At the Gates do with this massive entourage of musicians. I have only listened to it cursorily, so I probably shouldn't say much more. So yeah, just to sort of round up, I actually meant to open with the comment that I was reading a Decibel article where it just caught my eye on social media, I think, because it said just ranking all of the At the Gates albums. And the interesting thing is they ranked them all basically in the complete opposite order to how we have done today, in that The Red in the Sky is Ours was at the bottom, followed by With Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness, then a few of the newer ones, and slowly, and then obviously Slaughter of the Soul was number one. But then the impression I get just anecdotally from the fan base, not like legacy media like Decibel, but from the fan base itself, is that The Red in the Sky is Ours is actually an incredibly respected album within the wider death metal community, not just like crusty old elitists like us. The same goes for their other earlier material as well. They are an incredibly revered and respected band for people within the know in sort of a much wider death metal crowd than I think we realise. And Slaughter of the Soul, whilst some fans obviously probably hold it in the same regard as me in that they have to appreciate the fact that it got them into a certain kind of music, they'll kind of look at it not with absolute like disdain, like you would look at, for instance, a Saint Anger. But there is that sense of regret in that 1995, when that was released, was something of a watershed for extreme metal, and it did all go downhill from there. So I just wanted to point out it's interesting that legacy media tends to take a very kind of route one basic approach to At the Gates, whereas the fan base themselves seem to be much more like on our wavelength in terms of where this band's strength lay, as it were, and the fact that there's only sort of vestiges of that remain. So yeah, does anyone have any closing remarks or anything else they want to say about At the Gates before we wrap up?
No, just that it was great to talk about At the Gates. This one of the best metal bands to ever exist, and that's they cannot be, in my view, rated highly enough. So I was very happy to be called on to be a part of this today.
Well, yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have your thoughts on it. I'm really glad you joined. Yeah, and to echo what you said as well. As we've already said, those first few releases, utterly unique within not just death metal but metal in general, and there's something that the artists themselves could not really replicate. So yeah, if you're still listening and you haven't heard them yet, I don't know why you would, but please return to those albums, because they are something to behold. So yeah, Raphael, thank you very much for joining today. It's really great to have you back. Really enjoyed your contributions.
Well, thanks for having me once again.
And hello, okay. And Tyler, good to have you as always.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. That was really fun.
Yeah, I was actually surprised at how much, given the fact that there's only a handful of releases that sort of where the real substance of At the Gates lie. I was really impressed that we actually managed to talk about them for quite so long. I thought we were going to have to sort of branch out into Swedish death metal, but we'll probably have to save that for another episode. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. I will save the sort of rambling sign off that Jason normally does, because can't really do that. So I'll just round off by saying that I am a heterosexual. I am married to a woman. #no homo. And thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.